just east of Niagara Falls in northwest New York State. An area with the deceptively serene name of Love Canal turned out to be one of America's most notorious toxic waste horror stories.
It was a typical American neighborhood of the 1970s. A new development, neat homes, lots of trees, children playing outdoors, a school in walking distance. It was what was called a lovely residential area. But there was something the families who lived there didn't know. They were living on top of 20,000 tons of toxic waste. All they did know was that something strange and agonizing was happening to them.
The Love Canal originally got its name from entrepreneur William T. Love. In 1894, he began construction on a man-made canal that he envisioned would link the Niagara River to Lake Ontario.
His plan was to use the power of the river as it rushes towards the falls, diverting it before it goes over the falls, and carrying it north through a canal, which would wind up at this escarpment or cliff and pour down and provide the power that's necessary to generate electricity.
The canal was essentially a trench dug in the clay soil of the area. After only 3,000 feet were excavated, a pair of unforeseen events brought construction to a halt.
One was the depression of the 1890s, severe depression. Secondly was somebody named Tesla devised a way to have alternating current instead of direct current, so you didn't have to be right on top of the source of power.
Alternating current made it unnecessary to develop industry and Love's planned city adjacent to his canal. For the next several years, Love's unfinished canal served as a summer swimming hole for nearby residents. Then in 1942, Hooker Chemical Company acquired the canal.
They ended up using the property as pretty much a 16-acre hole in the ground at that point, 3,000 feet long by 80 feet wide to 100 feet wide, probably anywhere from 8 to 15 or 20 feet in depth. And they used it for disposal of industrial waste from a period of time from about 1942 to 1952 or 53.
By 1953, the canal was filled with over 20,000 tons of chemical wastes, including caustic solvents and pesticides. Hooker had no further use for the canal, and with no regulations in place to stop them at the time, they simply covered the dump site with a layer of clay and soil from the area. Soon grass grew and helped hide what festered just a few feet below.
Of course, everybody played on that area because it's not a canal, it's covered over. And sometimes kids would their feet would get irritated from running around in the canal.
As Niagara Falls' growing population spread, the New York Board of Education was looking for inexpensive land and expressed interest in the property Hooker owned. The chemical company offered to sell the no longer useful land for $1. The deed did contain a warning about the contents of the canal, but that did not stop the sale.
Well, they didn't build a school directly on top of the canal. They built a playground there. And on the black top of the playground, there was like a percolation of a taffy-like watery substance coming out of the ground into this playground.
At around the same time, there continued to be increased development in the area. A series of homes went up around the canal. None of the homes were built right on the canal. They were adjacent to it.
And then a lot of residents complained of not only smells in their basement, but of oozing of the similar types of chemicals into those sub pumps, into the drainage ditches around their basements.
The leachate that was found throughout the Love Canal community was generally a black goop, to use a technical, non-technical term. It was a very thick black material. It was very oily based. It almost looked like a tar-like material. It was more watery in some instances than in others.
Those who had bought homes in the area hadn't been warned in their deeds of what was beneath the grassy field.
One of the mothers whose young family lived here was Lois Marie Gibbs. She began to sense something was wrong.
In 1977, her son began attending the 99th Street School.
Her two children had been ill from birth. The oldest began to have seizures when he started school. Many of her neighbors were sick. Some had chemical ooze in their backyards. Kids played with fire rocks. When the rocks were thrown to the ground, they exploded in flames. Most of the children being born had birth defects. In 1 year, only 4 of 22 births were normal. Growing children were afflicted with mysterious contusions, epilepsy, severe asthma, liver problems, blood disease.
I just remember after living at Love Canal for a while, Michael got sick, and he kept getting new diseases. He had asthma, liver problems, immune system problem, urinary tract disorder, which required 2 operations to correct. I mean, it was just like one thing after the other, and I could not figure out what was wrong with him.
Around this time, a newspaper reporter wrote a story about the canal and what was buried in it. Now the residents had an explanation for the mysterious substances and illnesses, and Lois Gibbs decided something had to be done.
First, she tried to have her child transferred out of the school, and they told her that they wouldn't do it because there was no problem. There was no chemical problem there. And so she started going up and down the street, talking to people, talking to neighbors, asking if they were interested in joining a little group that would try to get the school cleaned up.
I had never done anything like this, she later wrote in the book that told her story. I was afraid a lot of doors would be slammed in my face. No doors were slammed. And although this middle-class American housewife had no experience as an organizer and no college education, she became the community's leader and formed a homeowners association.
For several years, chemicals have been seeping into the basements of a number of houses, including this one. The evidence is always there.
There was a report that talked about the different chemicals getting into people's homes, getting into their gardens, their backyards.
The people that were living there were smelling these odors in their basements. Many of the children claimed that they had skin rashes. And before you know it, there was a concern.
Awareness of the problem and complaints from the residents became much more widespread after the winter of 1977.
It was the precipitation event, the blizzard of '77, that actually overfilled the canal, the bathtub effect, with all of the winter snow, etc., and the actual wet season that we had in 1977 after this blizzard. We had an early spring, an early thaw, and all the water was forced underneath the canal from this clay pit, basically, to the top, and it started oozing out of the top of the canal.
In the late 1970s, there were no conclusive answers about the health risks and long-term effects of exposure to toxic wastes. Nobody was really sure what wastes were in the canal, but deadly dioxin was identified. The Environmental Protection Agency had been formed just a few years earlier and had not dealt with a public crisis like this before. The residents' fear turned to frustration and anger. A public health scare erupted.
How can you make decisions? Are you going to live there with your wife? Are you going to put your kids there?
There have been instances of birth defects and miscarriages among neighborhood families.
The state had been testing the neighborhood's air, soil, and groundwater and made an announcement for the homes closest to the canal.
The New York State Health Department recommended that pregnant women and children under the age of 2 immediately move out of the area.
How many chemicals have been identified as being underground here?
So far, we know of 88 specific chemicals that have been identified.
And of those 88, how many are suspected of causing cancer?
I think the number is 11.
You could see the fear on some of their faces today as men, women, and children gathered for blood tests to determine whether those here have developed abnormalities.
I am really, really afraid. We have decided we're going to get out one way or another. But right now, you know, you just can't jump, and where are we going to go?
We were a working class community. We didn't have money to just up and move and abandon our house. So we organized the Love Canal Homeowner Association, which was all of our neighbors.
Lois Gibbs was trying to start an organization, and she quickly learned how important the media was to be their voice.
Would you please tell me, do I let my 3-year-old stay?
The Love Canal became the focus of the growing environmental movement and was soon national news. On August 7, 1978, then-President Jimmy Carter declared Love Canal a disaster area, and those living nearest to the dump site were relocated.
New York Governor Hugh Carey ordered the state to buy the first 2 rows of homes along the canal, and those residents moved out. But Lois Gibbs and some 700 other families living outside the evacuated area were told they were not in imminent danger.
They put up a fence, and every time I went in and out of the driveway, I seen the fence, and I was told that people on that side of the fence had to leave and I had to stay, which didn't make sense to me at all.
Over the next 2 years, some of the remaining homeowners continued to battle for relocation, saying living near the polluted canal was putting their family's health at risk.
I lost a baby before it was even born. My next door neighbor had a stillborn. Her son is sick. Her son is sick. How many more kids have to be sick?
Some of the protesters used provocative tactics, such as burning effigies of Jimmy Carter, his wife, and daughter.
Right after the first relocation in August of 1978, they erected a 10-foot fence, a green fence, so it would be environmentally pleasant, around Love Canal. And then they put signs on the fence that said, hazardous area, dangerous, do not enter.
Infrared pictures were taken from the air to track the spread of the contaminants. Gray or black in the photos revealed the presence of the chemical waste. After another 2 years of activism by Lois Gibbs and other residents.
Today, the Environmental Protection Agency announced...
But things changed in the spring of 1980. The EPA had conducted a preliminary study that indicated that residents may have increased chromosomal abnormalities. But before the agency could confirm the findings or inform the residents, the study was leaked.
EPA was in a panic because they knew that this awful chromosome study was going to hit the newspapers. So they had an emergency team rush out to Niagara Falls to talk to these people.
We found 2 particular characteristics in this study which are ominous.
Environmental Protection Agency had done some blood work on some residents, and they said they had an unusually high number of chromosome breakages and higher risk of cancer, birth defects, or genetic damage in our children. People gathered at the Love Canal homeowner's office, and they started shouting and screaming. So when the EPA officials came over, the residents were so angry that they decided that if it's so safe to live at Love Canal, these 2 officials can live here, and they're not going to get evacuated until we get evacuated.
The standoff lasted just 5 hours, but the point was made.
President Carter was running for re-election. This was making headline news across the country. As a result of that sit-in and that protest and those hostage holdings, the federal government agreed to evacuate everybody at Love Canal, buying their homes. So we were out.
A second presidential declaration cleared the way for another 500 families to be relocated.
The residents of Love Canal celebrated today.
We got relief, we got safety, we got our lives back.
700 families started leaving Love Canal this afternoon.
It was the moment. It was the moment of relief in a sense that we're free.
Except for a few families who refused to move, Love Canal became a ghost town.
The national press coverage of Love Canal made Lois Gibbs a well-known name. 3,000 people wrote her asking how they could solve toxic waste problems in their areas.
Remember that we stood up here at Love Canal, ordinary, law-abiding people, and we weren't afraid.
What Lois Gibbs eventually did was move to Arlington, Virginia, to found the Citizens Clearinghouse for Hazardous Wastes. It works as an environmental crisis center. At the Center for the Study of Responsive Law, it is called the best grassroots organization in the U.S. In many ways, Lois Gibbs is the quintessential grassroots environmental hero, someone who has shown that one person can make a difference. I was naive, she said. I had a blind faith in government. I learned you've got to fight. She also says, I still don't consider myself an environmentalist. I don't eat bean sprouts and yogurt. I rather consider myself somebody who helps fight for justice.
New laws were introduced to prevent future Love Canals.
Occidental Chemical Company agreed to pay $129 million.
My 3 kids were born with birth defects. My wife's had cancer.
Gibbs became the public face of a movement to clean up toxic waste dumped by companies across the country. To deal with this pollution, Superfund legislation was enacted.
Superfund was established so if another Love Canal came on the horizon, there would be money there. You could go in, you could do the testing, you could do the cleanup, and then you could go after the responsible parties.
While sometimes criticized as costly and bureaucratic, Superfund has led to the remediation of nearly 400 toxic sites. Love Canal was among the first addressed, but it took nearly 2 decades and cost more than $350 million. Because the landfill turned out to be too big, too toxic, and too expensive to move, it was capped in clay and surrounded by a drainage system.
There were over 400 chemicals found in the leachate from the Love Canal landfill, from lead and arsenic to lindane, variety of other pesticides, to solvents such as benzene, toluene, xylene, host of others. Many of these chemicals cause cancer. Many of them cause liver problems, liver disease. Many of them cause central nervous system problems. Some cause birth defects.
Over the next few years, extensive efforts were made to clean up the neighborhood.
We cleaned 65,000 lineal feet of storm sewers around that entire area. And of course, the hazardous waste byproducts did find their way underground to a nearby set of creeks, the Black and Burkholz creeks that flow just north of Love Canal. We ended up testing the creek sediment and discovering that the same hazardous waste byproducts that were buried now have worked their way via water under the ground to the creek areas. One of the remedies were to actually dredge the creek.
Crews dealing with the toxic dump itself decided that trying to remove, transport, and store the chemicals somewhere else was inviting further disaster. The chemicals were going to have to stay where they were, and a better cover and containment system put in place. The 99th Street School and 239 homes were demolished and placed on top of the canal, and then covered with clay.
And over the top of it, we placed this synthetic liner, and this synthetic liner went directly over the entire 40-acre area, okay? And then after we placed the synthetic liner, we then installed this plastic liner. This liner goes over the entire 40-acre area. So when it rains, all of the precipitation will go through the ground and will actually hit the top of this liner, much like an umbrella. It will run off of it.
The runoff is then collected in an underground barrier drain system. It's then pumped up to the facility at the top of the Love Canal, where it's treated by carbon filters.
It is then discharged via storm sewer to the City of Niagara Falls' wastewater treatment plant, where it undergoes more filtration before clean water is discharged into the upper Niagara River.
The capping and drainage system handles the material so well that anything that gets through is minimal. And we have a series of over 200 monitoring wells in the entire neighborhood to make sure that the groundwater is not being impacted by any of the contamination.
More than 3 decades later, what happened to residents exposed to these chemicals? And what happened to the place that came to symbolize the nightmare of toxic waste in America?
And it was a black eye when it occurred in the late 70s. But the community came together and realized that the stigma from what took place was starting to diminish. So in '88, a decision was rendered that the area was suitable for rehabilitation.
The city wants to put Love Canal behind it. It's given Niagara Falls a pretty bad name, and we don't think we deserve it.
Although the area around the old landfill was fenced off, homes in the surrounding neighborhood were refurbished and offered at below market price. Nearly all the homes found a buyer.
I just read about Love Canal, up in Niagara Falls.
I remember Love Canal.
15 years ago, they had to move everybody out because of the toxic waste. Now they're selling homes there again.
I wasn't aware that they're selling homes there.
Well, don't you think we could pick up something kind of cheap?
The repopulation was met with protests by activists, including Lois Gibbs, who said the area was still not safe.
This is the Earth. The Earth shifts. And we saw what happened in the blizzard of '77 when we had the snow melt and the river rose, and that, they believe, created a lot of the Love Canal problem. It's foolish to think that they can contain it. They never took any chemicals out. The 20,000 tons of chemicals still remain in the center of Love Canal.
I think there's a legacy of doubt because people think that someday the landfill will leak. But we have monitoring wells around this site. So red flags would go up if there was a problem. The homes around Love Canal, especially the homes that were rehabilitated, where people are living in them today, it's probably one of the safest places on the planet to live.
But what happened to the residents who lived there 35 years ago? The leaked EPA report was a preliminary study. A follow-up study revealed that Love Canal residents had no higher rate of chromosomal abnormalities than the rest of Niagara County. Over the years, some studies have indicated a higher rate of birth defects and some cancers among former residents. But a direct link between the leaking canal and the long-term development of serious diseases has not been established.
To find out what hurt a relatively few people because of the myriad of environmental insults that are around, it's almost impossible to do. These are intrinsically difficult problems to evaluate scientifically.
I was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 3 years ago, and I'm stage 4 cancer. It's went to my liver. I worked at chemical plants. I was exposed to Agent Orange. I lived in Love Canal. I don't know where my cancer comes from.
"35 years after Love Canal captured the national spotlight, the story has resurfaced.
New concerns have emerged from the Love Canal era.
In 2011, a city crew repairing a sewer line discovered a pocket of chemical waste less than half a mile from the landfill. State and EPA investigators said there was no danger. The waste was isolated, had not leaked from the landfill, and was believed to be left over from the original cleanup. But 6 families in the surrounding neighborhood have filed lawsuits. They say the discovery exposed them to harmful chemicals, and now believe the landfill itself is not properly contained and is damaging their health. The battle over Love Canal continues.
The Love Canal originally got its name from entrepreneur William T. Love. In 1894, he began construction on a man-made canal that he envisioned would link the Niagara River to Lake Ontario.
His plan was to use the power of the river as it rushes towards the falls, diverting it before it goes over the falls, and carrying it north through a canal, which would wind up at this escarpment or cliff and pour down and provide the power that's necessary to generate electricity.
The canal was essentially a trench dug in the clay soil of the area. After only 3,000 feet were excavated, a pair of unforeseen events brought construction to a halt.
One was the depression of the 1890s, severe depression. Secondly was somebody named Tesla devised a way to have alternating current instead of direct current, so you didn't have to be right on top of the source of power.
Alternating current made it unnecessary to develop industry and Love's planned city adjacent to his canal. For the next several years, Love's unfinished canal served as a summer swimming hole for nearby residents. Then in 1942, Hooker Chemical Company acquired the canal.
They ended up using the property as a pretty much a 16-acre hole in the ground at that point, 3,000 feet long by 80 feet wide to 100 feet wide, probably anywhere from 8 to 15 or 20 feet in depth. And they used it for disposal of industrial waste from a period of time from about 1942 to 1952 or 53.
By 1953, the canal was filled with over 20,000 tons of chemical wastes, including caustic solvents and pesticides. Hooker had no further use for the canal, and with no regulations in place to stop them at the time, they simply covered the dump site with a layer of clay and soil from the area. Soon grass grew and helped hide what festered just a few feet below.
Of course,
Just east of Niagara Falls in northwest New York State, an area with the deceptively serene name of Love Canal turned out to be one of America's most notorious toxic waste horror stories.
It was a typical American neighborhood of the 1970s, a new development, neat homes, lots of trees, children playing outdoors, a school in walking distance. It was what was called a lovely residential area. But there was something the families who lived there didn't know. They were living on top of 20,000 tons of toxic waste. All they did know was that something strange and agonizing was happening.
But he played on that area because it's not a canal, it's covered over. And sometimes kids would their feet would get irritated from running around in the canal.
As Niagara Falls' growing population spread, the New York Board of Education was looking for inexpensive land and expressed interest in the property Hooker owned. The chemical company offered to sell the no longer useful land for $1. The deed did contain a warning about the contents of the canal, but that did not stop the sale.
Well, they didn't build a school directly on top of the canal. They built a playground there. And on the black top of the playground, there was like a percolation of a taffy-like watery substance coming out of